Hey, good afternoon, APUSHers. Welcome to this question and answer session. My name is Mr. Lagerwey. I'll be hosting us today. Good to see a lot of familiar names in the chat. Excellent, excellent. If you folks have some big questions, this is a question and answer session, and so I have a little bit of an economic agenda prepared for us, but I'm mostly here to answer your questions, so it might be a little bit shorter than normal. But yeah, just let me know if you have big questions, big topics. Go ahead and put those in the ask a question function down below. If you have small questions as we go, or you want me to expand upon something, to repeat something, throw that into the chat. That'd be a good idea. And yeah, I like the idea. Adventurous APUSHers. Good idea, Perla. Sounds good. So a couple of reminders. We have a bunch of live streams coming up soon, including one that's going to be tomorrow night, reviewing units 5 and 6. Pretty broad overview, not as much of the skill stuff, a lot more content. And then next week, Tuesday, you got the Unit 5 cram session at 9 o'clock covering, sorry, that should be Unit 6. My apologies. Unit 6, and that will be going over Unit 6, 1865 to 1900-ish, let's say, maybe a little bit later, but also doing some writing skills, kind of like what we did last night for Period 5. Then next week, we got some bonus cram sessions because we're starting the 2 a week next week. So we're doing some dates and study tips. Cram session on Thursday at 7 o'clock, so be aware of the time change there. And then that Thursday, a different streamer is doing a Unit 7 review. And then the next week, we have the Unit 7 cram session. So we got plenty of content and writing and stuff like that to keep you going. That should be all set and ready to go. Remember, if you want to get notified of these, follow Fiveable on social media at various points, right? That's always a good idea. And then what are we doing today? Again, question and answers and economic review. Sounds good. So let's tackle your questions. And if I can get my remote to work a second, that would be good. Let's tackle your questions. First of all, let's look at the bottom. Ooh, we got 4 of them already. This is exciting. I'm happy about this. Okie dokie. So do you know when the practice FRQ College Board had planned is happening? I heard it was Monday, but what time? Don't know that specifically. In fact, we don't even know that it's necessarily going to be Monday. They said maybe Monday, but it could be next week sometime, but just the last week of April, by the end of April. So that hopefully means Monday. That would be nice, but I don't know a specific time on that, unfortunately. But hopefully that'll get you some practice questions and stuff like that, right? Good. Let's see, Angela, you were, by the way, Angela, you were asking to see the slides from last night's cram session, and I don't think your email allows you to get outside emails, and so I tried to share it with you, but it wouldn't let me. So just check out the emails, check out the slides that are embedded with the cram session from last night, and that should be helpful if you want to review those slides. All right, so Angela asked a great question. Oh, you got it, fantastic, okay. You asked a great question. How did nativism impact sectionalism? So this is kind of a period 4 type question, right? This is talking about, well, probably, yeah, before the Civil War. So nativism, we're talking the 1840s and 50s, especially the Know Nothing Party, the American Party, and those are ones that are going to be opposing the new immigrants. And help me out. This is a question and answer session. Let's keep it going back and forth. Who are the new immigrants of the 1840s and 50s, or at least larger waves during that time, that are opposed by the nativist know-nothings? Yeah, German and Irish. Yep, Eastern European, Segev, is going to be later in the century, so that's going to be the 1880s, 90s, 1900s, and then they'll eventually set up the quota system in the 1920s. So nativism before the Civil War is mostly against the Irish and the Germans, partly because of the temperance movement, and they tend to drink a lot, partly because of anti-Catholic bias, right? Things like that. And so how does nativism impact sectionalism? Not directly, let's say, but let me just kind of explain the connection between the two. Because nativism before the Civil War is occurring where there are immigrants, like Germans and Irish. Where are there immigrants? Largely up north, because the north is where the industry is. The north is where there's going to be a lot more manufacturing jobs, factories, large cities, et cetera, urbanization. And so antebellum urbanization is going to be occurring up north with immigrants, and thus that is going to cause nativism. There's not as much nativism down south, partly because there just aren't as many immigrants down south. And remember, if you remember from the antebellum era and period 4, Democrats tend to be a lot more pro-immigrant. They tend to vote Democratic. And the Whigs tended to be a lot more anti-immigrant, or at least make them a little bit more American. And so down south, where there were quite a few Democrats, they were more okay with the immigrants than people up north were. So I wouldn't say that nativism directly impacts sectionalism. It's more like nativism is a result of already existing sectionalism, if that makes a little bit of sense. So because all the immigrants are going up to the north, especially the northeast, that's going to be a really big deal, especially places like Boston, New York, et cetera, that have large immigrant populations. Okay. Great question. Let's see. This would be, Fady was asking, explain how regional interests affected debates about the role of the federal government from 1800 to 1848. That sounds like a prompt. I'm not writing your essay for you. What do you think you're trying to pull here? No. Yeah, that's a really big question, right? And there's lots of potential stuff you could talk about here. But again, kind of going back to what we were just talking about, keep in mind that before the Civil War, which is during this time period, period 4, the antebellum era, up north there's going to be a whole lot more manufacturing, and down south there's going to be a whole lot more agriculture. And so they're going to have different opinions about the federal government depending on what they want the federal government to do, but largely start with geography and start with economics. And so up north, there's going to be a whole lot more of an interest in the government being larger to be able to protect manufacturers, protect patents. Think like Hamilton's financial plan from the 1790s. And they're also going to be very interested in the federal government doing the infrastructure necessary to have a thriving economy. Think the American system, right? Henry Clay, the National Republicans, the Whigs that favor the government getting involved in canals, in railroads, in roads, things like that. Whereas down south, they do not want the federal government nearly as involved, partly because they don't need to, at least they think, because they have navigable rivers that they use and it's more agricultural. And they're worried that if the national government gets too strong, then it's going to be potentially able to take away their slaves. So one of the reasons that the Democrats tend to be a bit more conservative and small government, at least during this time period, is keep your hands off my slaves. Now, that being said, they do have debates over the roles of the federal government about like foreign policy and military stuff. So the North during this time, this goes from 1800, that's the election of Thomas Jefferson, all the way to the Seneca Falls Convention, Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Southern Democrats are much more interested in expansion, much more interested in gaining more land for agricultural expansion, and thus they're going to be in favor of the War of 1812 against Britain and getting rid of the natives, Indian removal. They're going to be much more in favor of the war with Mexico, whereas up north, the Federalists at first, and then after the 1815 Hartford Convention, once they go away and then the Whigs come about, the Whigs and the Federalists are both going to be opposed to both of those wars for the most part, right? And then be aware that they're also going to argue over things like the tariff. They're going to argue over things like slavery. So the North kind of wants some tariffs on items. So that's the federal government exercising taxation over imported goods. And then slavery in the territories, that's a big deal too. There's just a lot of stuff. So regional interests, think about what the priorities of the North are, priorities of the South, and then the role of federal government is nice and broad. So go nuts. Talk about any event that happens during that time period, market revolution, foreign policy, etc., and you should be good. Yeah, awesome. Thanks for asking. Let's see. We have a whole bunch of other ones coming up in the question queue as well. Yeah, the Great Famine caused many Irish to move to America, but what caused the Germans to move to America? Oh, I accidentally clicked the wrong one there. Yeah, the potato famine causes the Irish to move over, but also economic opportunities in general, right? Germany at this point is still in the process of becoming a nation state, and so there's a little bit of economic instability back home. I wouldn't really worry about that too much. This is not AP Euro. The main things, yeah, push and pull factors. The main thing would be to be aware of the pull factors. Both of them are pulled in by the promise of industrial work. Think building the Erie Canal. A lot of Irish immigrants do that. Think industrial jobs up north in textile mills, etc. Towns up north. Push factors could be context. There just isn't a whole lot of it. I mean, you could maybe talk about like the Irish potato famine, but for the Germans, you're like, well, Otto von Bismarck hasn't happened yet. It's just kind of too amorphous to maybe use. But yeah, coming here for economic opportunity, maybe for some religious opportunity too. A lot of Germans tend to be Lutheran and different kinds of Lutherans, so they're looking for a fresh start. A lot of them move to the west. In fact, if you look at the census data, the most recent census data we have from 2010, it shows that German ethnicity is the most prevalent amongst the most number of counties nationwide. So look up the 2010 ethnicity by county map of the United States. It's fascinating to look at, and you'll see Germans all over the place, right? So there's a lot of them too. Let's see, kind of a little bit related. Ria was asking about who were the old immigrants and who were the new immigrants and when was that a whole thing? Yeah, so if we're ignoring period 8 and 9 because that's not on the exam, let's sort of talk about the period we do need to be aware of, periods 3 through 7. Old immigrants would be especially Anglo and Northern European. So we're talking English, Welsh, Scottish, Scots-Irish, people like that, Dutch, etc. And then even getting into the 1830s and 40s, like we were just talking about, even the Irish and the Germans would be considered old immigrants. So the English are going to come around in period 2, right? Jamestown, 1607, all the way continuing for a long time. They never really go away. And there's going to be some smattering of French around New Orleans, right, during the colonial era, Dutch around New York and New Jersey, what was once New Amsterdam, etc. So that's going to be 1700s. If you're talking 1700s, a little bit of Germans. Ben Franklin gets a little bit worried about the Germans taking over. Think Germantown, which was a big battle of the Revolutionary War. So the old immigrants would be people that are from the north and the west of Europe. So I would start with the English and the Dutch, but then I would even move into the French, German, and Irish because the old immigrants are going to refer to anybody before the Civil War. After the Civil War, you're going to get a whole lot more of those new immigrants. So we're talking now the 1770s, 1780s, 1790s, 1900 to about 1924 or so when they put in the Quota Act, 1921. Those new immigrants are going to include people like the Chinese before the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the Japanese before the Gentleman's Agreement, and then lots of Southern and Eastern Europeans. So Italians, Greeks, Polish people, Slavic people of various sorts, Jewish people, especially from Russia and Poland, Russians just in general. And that's going to be the so-called new immigrants, and that's going to be after about 1880. So if you're looking post-1880, remember the shift tends to go more Southern and Eastern. Be aware of where that is. That's kind of the difference between old and new immigrants. Awesome. All right. Let's see. Another question somebody had. Perla was asking, would you say that the corruption in Grant's administration greatly impacted the failure of Reconstruction? I wouldn't say it's a non-issue. I would say that, well, two things. One, the College Board kind of skimps over the Grant administration, so you don't have to know a whole lot about like the whiskey ring and things like that. I wouldn't say it's a non-issue, but it's not a great impact. That's probably overstating it a little bit. So remember, if you were in the cram session last night for period 5, we talked about how Reconstruction fails for 2 reasons. One, the South is intransigent; they're resistant. They don't want to. No blacks for no rights for black people. And 2, the North just gets sick of it. And one of the reasons the North might get sick of it and does get sick of it is because the Grant administration is so corrupt that they start to focus more on civil service reform. And the Democrats think eventually your Grover Clevelands and people like that who are going to run on a civil service reform ticket, they are going to be more interested in cleaning up the politicians and cleaning up D.C. than on continuing to reinforce this thing called Reconstruction down south. So the two are somewhat connected that way, where the priorities tend to shift because of the corruption. I wouldn't say that people go, Grant's corrupt, let's stop Reconstruction. That's a little bit too straightforward. But yeah, people's priorities begin to shift partly because of Grant's administration's corruption, and they just get sick of Reconstruction in general. They'd rather focus on other things. Good question. Let's see. When does corruption actually become an issue, and during which administrations is it important to know of? Kind of that one. I mean, a little bit of that. I would say for corruption, the big ones, be aware of Andrew Jackson and the spoils system, the corrupt bargain election of 1824 with John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay. Maybe corrupt per se, maybe not. And then real corruption tends to be during the Gilded Age, so Unit 6. So after James Garfield gets assassinated, remember, by an office seeker who's like, give me a job. I deserve a job because I supported you. And then he's like, I don't know who you are. And then he gets shot in the train station. After that, there's a big push for a lot of reform and a lot of the corruption, think Boss Tweed, etc. That's going to be happening later. Perla Teapot Dome is going to be in the 1920s. So that's Warren G. Harding, etc. So when you think about corruption, I would think about a lot of the Gilded Age. So that's when you get political machines, again, Boss Tweed kind of stuff. And that's also where you're going to see people trying to pass civil service reform acts, Grover Cleveland, Benjamin Harrison, those kind of people. The Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act, where it's like, hey, we're going to give you jobs based on how good you are at your job, not based on who you know and how much money you give. Good thing we've taken care of that in American politics. And then also be aware of the progressives who will then try to clean up a lot of that corruption, especially when it comes to the Gilded Age. They will try to institute reforms. Again, think Wisconsin Plan, recall, referendum, initiative, other things like that. Yeah. So, yeah, and then Teapot Dome scandal plus other corruption in the 1920s, just with laissez-faire, not a whole lot. Warren G. Harding constantly philandering on the side, right, having mistresses and etc. Let's see. Am I still answering the old SAQs and prompts that are open on the College Board? Yes, Perla. Yeah. If they're locked, that means you can't respond to them anymore. But if you'd like to respond to ones from, I believe it's period 4, 5, 6, those kind of ones are still open. Absolutely. Yeah. So if they're still open and unlocked, you're welcome to answer those. There is a deadline for non-cram people, but for cram people, we give you an extra week or so. So if you'd like some feedback on that, feel free to do that. Let's see. All right, there's a bunch of stuff here. Not sure exactly the right order to go into this, but let's just jump in with a couple of them. Could we explain how America got involved in World War II? Nikki, that's a good question. So first of all, excuse me, I just ate lunch before this. First of all, you have to understand the causes of World War II itself, right? So you need to be aware that like Hitler's taking over a whole bunch of stuff in Europe. The Japanese are taking over a whole bunch of stuff in Asia and the Pacific. And so why does the United States get involved? Well, initially we don't want to, right? Initially we see it as a European war or an Asian war. When Japan invades China, we cut off their oil, and that makes Japan really angry. But the reason the United States the United States gradually gets involved even before Pearl Harbor with things like the arsenal of democracy, right? So lend-lease, cash carry, destroyers for bases. We're helping out mostly Britain as they're fighting the Nazis, right? Yeah, that's what happens. Let's see. 1 second. Let me just try to take care of some of this stuff. Oh, looks like our chat's getting cluttered with some nonsense. Huh. Well, let's try to get rid of that. Just to make sure that people are not having to see too much of that. Although I'm not aware of the reference, so maybe that's what's happening. So America gets involved in World War II because the Japanese attacked us at Pearl Harbor, but remember we were involved selling things to the Allies even before that, so be aware of that. How America gets involved in World War II. So the how is lend-lease, cash carry, destroyers for bases. There's the Neutrality Acts, but Roosevelt, FDR, who's president at the time, tries to push us to get more and more involved, partially because he realizes the Nazis are a big threat and he wants to be able to prepare and help England. So England is standing alone, Battle of Britain, that kind of stuff, Darkest Hour with Winston Churchill. And FDR wants to be able to help them. And so he's going to turn the United States into the arsenal of democracy. We're going to produce all of the weapons, material, ammunition, etc., that we can ship over there. And then, of course, the Battle of the Atlantic, the Nazis, submarines, U-boats, Unterseebooten, undersea boats, literally, are trying to sink American shipping. And we try to do the convoy system, and we're sort of involved in a war there before we're even involved in the technical war. So it gets really tricky. And then Pearl Harbor happens, December 7, 1941. Japan attacks us, and we go, no, you didn't. And we start to attack Japan and gear up. A couple days later, Nazi Germany declares war on the United States too. And so the United States goes to war with Nazi Germany too, which really helped out. It really helped out FDR, because FDR was like, the Nazis are a bigger threat, but they didn't attack us. How do we solve this? So then we end up fighting for both against both of them, and with the Soviet Union and England. Perla, would Darkest Hour be a good movie to watch for like context, or not really? Not really. I mean, it's really, really just about Churchill and World War II in England. And so, yeah, it'd be maybe more useful for AP Euro, but even for that, or for AP World, it's pretty specific. It's a good movie. It's well done for sure. And then, yeah, Code Girls is a good book about decoding messages during World War II. Yeah, lots of good books about World War II, right? Unbroken is fantastic. Yeah. In the Garden of Beasts. The one that I'm about to read sometime in the next couple of weeks is Eric Larson's latest book, The Splendid and the Vile. And that's all about Churchill, kind of Darkest Hour stuff. Yeah. So, Perla, was that good? Sorry, Nikki, was that good enough for explaining why we got involved in World War II? Okay, awesome. Alrighty. Then, let's see. Fady was asking a question. Fady, your question about supply side economics and trickle down economics, that's pretty specific to period 8 and even period 9 actually, after 1980 with the Reagan administration. So that's pretty specific to things we don't need to do for the exam. I can cover that real quick, but just for those of you that are like, what was that? Don't worry a whole lot about that. So supply side economics or trickle down economics. So supply side economics says we need to stimulate the supply side of the economy, not the demand side of the economy, AKA make sure that the companies are doing well, and then help out giving tax cuts to the rich, some deregulation, things like that. And that way corporations who also have tax cuts will make a whole bunch of money, create a bunch of supply, and then that'll eventually trickle down. So you help out the job creators, you help out the people at the top, and you cut taxes for them, and eventually all that job creation will trickle down as people get jobs, and that'll be a whole lot better. That is a very conservative philosophy, very controversial, right? The so-called Laffer curve allegedly was going to make it so that these reductions in taxes would pay for themselves, because reducing in taxes would lead to more spending, and that would produce more tax revenue, and so this wouldn't increase the deficit. That turned out not to be the case at all. But trickle-down economics is still very, very controversial. Not sure there's a whole bunch of consensus on that. I think the majority of economists don't think that really works a whole lot. You kind of need to have a combination of both, but that's kind of stepping into political territory. So, yeah, that's Reagan in period 9, so 1981 to 1989, cutting taxes for corporations and the people at the top with the hopes that they create jobs that then trickle down the money to the rest of the people. Let's see. Perla was talking about Tom Ritchie said that he doesn't think there would be a DBQ after the 1900s. What do I think about that? I think that there's no way of knowing, so you couldn't possibly say anything like that. That's just kind of irresponsible, actually, because we just don't know that. He may. I didn't hear him say that, right? So I don't know how he said it, but it could be unlikely. But that's why they cut it off at period 7. So period 7 is basically all in the 1900s, with a couple exceptions to the Spanish-American War stuff, and there absolutely could be a DBQ on period 7. I mean, yeah, if you were to ask me my guesses, I'd be like, oh, probably a period 4 or a period 5 or 6 or something like that. But we just have no way of knowing. They could require you to know period 7, and there's a lot that happens in period 7. So, yeah, the odds are about, well, say 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The odds are about 20% that it'll be one of those periods. Just who knows, right? Let's see here. It's a big topic in AP Gov. Yep. And then, yeah, a lot of the optional student practice DBQs have been 3 or 4. Sierra, are you talking about the ones on Fiveable, the ones on the College Board, or ones from your teacher, or things like that? College Board. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, they've had some of those on there. I would say personally that periods 3 and 4 they have a lot of stuff, but it's also the earlier ones, so they might give you a lot of that. So who knows? Period 6 is just hugely all over the place. So I'm hoping it's not that, but you never know. Could be. Let's take a look at some other questions. So a lot of questions on the Great Depression and the New Deal. All right. Angela was talking about what effects did the Great Depression have on other areas like social, cultural, political, etc. Great questions. So let me see if I can do a couple things here in a second. There we go. Yeah, let's talk about that. So the Great Depression influences a bunch of stuff. First of all, it's going to influence culture because people are going to create poems and books and songs about the Great Depression, right? So no depression in heaven, etc. Socially, it's going to lead to the downfall of President Hoover. So politically, partly because of the bonus march, right? President Hoover is going to kind of look bad. Everyone's going to blame him. He's the president during the Great Depression, and arguably he doesn't do enough or fast enough, but also he just gets the blame because he's president, right? Yeah. How does it influence other things? It's going to influence FDR because it allows FDR to be elected as president and then inaugurated in 1933. It's going to lead to his creation of the so-called New Deal coalition. And so you're going to see a whole bunch of African Americans and lower class people, working class people, blue collar workers, etc., joining the Democratic Party. That's a big deal. Yeah, so culturally, it's going to lead to new things. I mean, people go to the movies a little bit so that way they can deal with this. Think Gone with the Wind, etc. And then think about, creation of movies and music and things like that. Did the Great Depression cause a religious following increase? I'm not necessarily sure. A little bit. That's a little bit beyond what I know about there. But yeah, the Great Depression shifted the political parties and their followers. Yeah, Tegas, that's one of the really big shifts. So when you're looking at like why Democrats and Republicans have kind of switched sides, that's the start of the switch. Now, it doesn't actually fully happen until the 60s and 70s, but FDR is one of the persons that begins, well, first of all, the major shift is African Americans are no longer voting for the Republican Party, aka the Party of Lincoln, right? It's become the party of big business, and they just don't give a rat's behind about African Americans during this time period, or so the African Americans think. And so they gravitate toward FDR, who tends to be a bit more interested in doing things for them, at least according to what they think. Yeah, so that's a really, really big deal. Speaking of the New Deal, which programs and laws fell under each R? There's a lot of examples, and which falls under what? Yeah, Rhea, let's talk about that a little bit. So the New Deal involves the 3 R's, aka relief, recovery, reform. Relief is going to be giving help to people who need it really, really fast. Think Emergency Banking Act. Think, shoot, the name is escaping me, but other like direct assistance to the poor stuff. And then you're going to see recovery, and that's going to be more like the National Recovery Act, the AAA, the CCC, right? The Civilian Conservation Corps, putting young men to work in national parks. The AAA, Agricultural Adjustment Agency, where they pay farmers not to harvest or not to kill hogs, things like that, so that way the price can go up. And then plenty of other things like the Works Progress Administration and other things that do a lot of infrastructure projects. And then reform. Reform is going to be the last one, the one that lasts the longest. So think of things like the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, that oversees the regulation of stock trading to make sure there's not a lot of sketchy stuff going on there. You can talk about the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. That's the one that makes sure that banks are able to be steady and that your deposits are safe no matter what. You could talk about Social Security Act, right? That's a little bit of relief as well as reform. So you have old age and unemployment benefits and pensions and stuff like that, disability pension, etc. That's a really big deal. Yeah, a lot of those are challenged by the courts or challenged in the courts, right? So things like the National Recovery Act is struck down by the Supreme Court. They argue that it's too large and unconstitutional, but a lot of those still show up, right? So you could talk about like the Social Security Act still exists, right? Et cetera, et cetera. Ooh, what's this that we're sharing here? The Fiveable New Deal PDF? Ooh, I'm happy about this. Oh, yeah. That looks good to me. Looks good to me. Wonder if I actually made that. It could have been. If that was taken from the study guide. Because I did the one on period 7. Ooh, there was a lot of stuff there. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that has a lot of good ones. Nice job. So that'd be very helpful. Yeah, some of them are challenged in the courts. National Recovery Act is probably the most famous. The NIRA and the NRA and things like that, industrial ones. The ones that involve price ceilings and a lot of regulations, that's challenged by the courts too. So there you go. Yeah, that's yeah. All right. So that's good there. Could I explain the first and second confiscation acts during the Civil War? Sure thing, Alicia. So confiscation acts, right? Those are trying to take away the slaves that are owned by the Confederacy. Because remember, property includes slaves at the time. And so confiscation of, or contraband is what confiscated property is called, right? So first of all, there's Benjamin Butler asking President Lincoln, like, what do I do with this? And then President Lincoln says, all right, you're able to have confiscation of enemy property because they're using them in rebellion. And this way we can weaken the Confederacy and help the United States. So first confiscation act in 61 that says any slaves that fight for the Confederate military, there aren't any, but ones that are like helping out, you know, building stuff, they can be confiscated because they were used to support the rebellion. And then the second one in 62 says that like any Confederate official or person in the military or civilian who doesn't already surrender and just let the United States take over would have their slaves freed also. And so this is only, but it only applies to Confederate areas that have been occupied by the U.S. Army. So it makes it sort of, these are leading to the Emancipation Proclamation, which would be a good idea to be aware of. So the confiscation acts, think of them as like taking slaves away from Southerners. Think Benjamin Butler and early versions of the Emancipation Proclamation, which frees all of the slaves in all the areas that the United States hasn't taken over yet or retaken. And it allows the slaves then to run away from the Confederacy and join the United States Army. That's a double benefit for the United States. Yeah. Hopefully that was all good. So confiscation acts, again, taking slaves from the South. How and why did FDR serve more than 2 terms? Kind of going back to that there. Yeah, Emma, FDR serves more than 2 terms because there's no constitutional amendment that says that he can't, right? So he's in the middle of the Great Depression and the middle of World War II. He's like, look, we got a good thing going. Let's not switch horses in the middle of the stream sort of thing. And so he says, look, I'm being successful. We're going through a bunch of crises, the Great Depression, and eventually World War II. And so by 1940, when he runs for a 3rd term, it is very controversial. And a lot of people are like, ooh, Washington didn't do that. You're breaking with precedent and pattern, and you're breaking what you're supposed to do. But there's no law against it, no constitutional law against it until the lame duck 20th Amendment, 22nd Amendment that's passed that changes that. But yeah, he's allowed to do that because there's no law that says he mayn't. And he argues that it's important to stay with the steady working leadership. So there you go. Let's see. So what did FDR do to help organize labor? Ooh, this would be the National Labor Relations Board, NLRB, right? And he allows unions to organize. And so labor unions and blue-collar workers and working rights people frequently will go to FDR and go to the Democratic Party because he helps them organize and helps them negotiate. He's going to help them sort of get legal status for their unions. So the National Labor Relations Board is maybe one specific example. The Wagner Act. Yeah, okay, Rhea, good job. Yeah, the Wagner Act also encourages unions and allows them to exist, right? And so we start to see unions getting more legal protection rather than just being attacked all the time under the Sherman Antitrust Act, et cetera, right? Yeah, so he helps organize labor that way. Plus just being instituting things like minimum wage and price controls or minimum safety standards, things like that. Those are all going to help organize labor too, albeit not directly. Glass-Steagall Act is related to it. It is FDR. That's the one that says that banks that do investment can't be also banks that do deposits. It's kind of separating the two, so creating two different kinds of banks. And of course, that gets repealed in the late 1990s, which makes Bernie Sanders very mad because he's always about like, bring back Glass-Steagall, right? Because he thinks that that's one of the reasons why we had the 08-09 Great Recession. Doesn't like the banking collapse because they're investing too much money, and then when they collapse, it causes problems in the economy, etc. Yep. Let's see. The significance of Lincoln suspending habeas corpus, Alicia. So that's going to be during the Civil War, and Lincoln is going to be able to lock up whoever he wants, whenever he wants, for as long as he wants, without charging them with a crime. So that's very, very significant because it's unconstitutional. He gets some permission to do it, but it's during a rebellion, right? So he's like, well, I can do this because there's an open rebellion, but it's pretty sketchy. So he uses that to lock up Copperheads or peace Democrats who disagree with the war effort. He also uses it to lock up Maryland pro-secession people because he doesn't want Maryland to vote to secede because that would surround D.C. with a bunch of Confederate territory. So he locks them up until they can vote to stay, and then he lets them go. So kind of a genius move, but also very, very sketchy. Copperheads are just people that are pro-Confederate sympathizers up north. Like a copperhead is a deadly snake, and a snake in the grass is a term for a traitor. So copperheads like Clement Vallandigham are going to be considered like traitorous people. Peace Democrats sometimes are the same thing, but seen as being like pro-Confederate sympathizing Northerners. Okay. Then around what time period did the first wave of feminism take place? There's a lot of different scholarship on that, and people have different answers to that. You should be aware of women's rights in a variety of roles. I would say first wave feminism is going to happen in the 1960s, but you could also make the argument that it's going to happen in the 1920s with Margaret Sanger and birth control and stuff like that. But then again, why not talk about the progressives or the cult of domesticity and the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention, or Republican motherhood and Abigail Adams and Remember the Ladies, right? So yeah, I would say feminism starts to become a thing in the 1960s. Think of reproductive rights. Think of women wanting to get the right to work, to have time off, to not get discriminated against. Think Title IX in the 1970s, et cetera, et cetera. But there's a whole bunch of stuff that goes way earlier. So usually when people say first wave feminism, they mean the 1960s. But not always. And you should be aware of women's rights that go way before that too, right? Because obviously the test's going to stop in 1945. Let's see, Ria is asking, what's the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine? So that Monroe Doctrine, remember, says Western Hemisphere, all the Americas, Latin America, North and South America, Central America, all of that is off limits to Europe. Europe, stay out. No more colonization. We got this. We're the United States. You stay out. The Roosevelt corollary just means something that goes alongside of or accompanies, and that comes from Teddy Roosevelt. So Monroe Doctrine was 1823, and everyone just kind of laughed and was like, yeah, sure, whatever. And then they kept each other away anyway because of the balance of power. But by the time of the Roosevelt corollary in the early 1900s, the United States has grown into a world power, and Teddy Roosevelt, who's president after McKinley gets shot, he says, look, not only should Europe stay out, but the United States has the authority to go in. So if anybody misbehaves, any Latin American or Caribbean country that misbehaves, we have the right to intervene to make sure that they are paying back their debts. They're protecting property, protecting credit, especially from investors in the United States and Europe, because if they default on their loans, if they are chaotic, if they don't respect European property, Europeans might use that as an excuse to get involved and reconquer territory. And so the United States is going to safeguard all those areas and say, Europe, stay out. We got this. Don't worry. Your investments are safe. No need to bring your gunboats around here. So that's the Roosevelt corollary. It's just the United States stepping up a whole bunch and getting involved in the Caribbean and Central America, much to the detriment of a lot of stuff there. And yeah, that's related to the Panama Canal in the sense that, I mean, TR helps Panama become a country to secede from Colombia, and then they give him the Panama Canal and thanks for that. And then he starts to dig it, and it takes a while, but that's part of the United States kind of, having control over much of the Americas militarily, including the Panama Canal and the Panama Canal Zone. That is part of the United States for almost a century. Yeah, that's going to be a big deal too. Let's see. Could you explain the differences between capitalism, socialism, communism, and fascism and all those things? That's a lot of isms. Yeah. Great question, Angela. So when you're thinking about that, couple of things. One, capitalism is a description of an economic system, right? Sometimes called free market system. It's based on supply and demand. It's based on whatever anyone wants to sell for or buy for. So it's all market prices, supply and demand, free market. You can make your own decisions, very individualistic. 100% capitalism is a free-for-all, and it's called laissez-faire, where the government has hands off, doesn't do anything, doesn't get involved. Yeah, no countries really have that. But the United States gets kind of close during the period 6, so the Gilded Age, etc., although the government really takes sides of the big business, so that's not really laissez-faire, I suppose. But yeah, capitalism is supply and demand, free market, etc. Socialism is an economic system where the government takes control of certain key industries or certain key manufacturing parts. And so the United States actually has some instances of this, some of which come about from the populists or the progressives or FDR's New Deal. So that's going to be things like, well, even just the post office, right? That could be considered a socialistic program because the United States government controls that. There's not really a private entity that does that. You could talk about Social Security. You could talk, so anytime the government gets involved, even the graduated income tax, right? The fact that you pay more income tax percentage-wise as you get richer as a way to sort of help them pay their fair share. That's a socialistic program a little bit. It's the government getting involved in the economy. More regulations, so safety features could be considered part of that, but not really. That's just called regulated capitalism. Communism, and this is the part that gets kind of complicated, communism is both an economic system and a political system. And this is where it gets confusing, right? People often use socialism to be like, you're a socialist. And they like compare that to Cuba and Russia and Venezuela and places like that. And it's just not really that useful. Socialism says the government gets involved in some major things, but that could involve healthcare, Medicare, Medicaid, sure, but also like Bernie Sanders single payer type stuff. Or like what a lot of the Scandinavian countries have, or Britain's national health system, health service, that kind of stuff. That's considered socialism too. Communism, the idea here is we don't need to make the inequality less like in socialism. We want to flatten it all together. So generally the idea is this is called a centrally planned economy. The idea is that the government makes decisions. No one is unemployed because everyone either works for the government or, pretty much works for the government. The government takes all of the stuff and then redistributes it equally, except all of the communism that's ever been tried ends up, because of this thing called sin, fallen human nature and people being bad, they don't get past the point where the dictator takes all the stuff and then never happens. So what we often see is not communism, but Stalinism, where the person in charge takes all the stuff, gives it out to their cronies, and then doesn't give a whole lot to everybody, and everybody starves, partially because there's less incentive, right? If you're going to make 50 grand a year, no matter how hard you work, you're not going to work very hard sometimes, at least some people, right? And what if you can't work? Well, then you're fine. So the thing is, one of the reasons why people are sometimes drawn to socialism and communism versus capitalism is, on paper, they appear to take care of people like that a little bit more. Capitalism just says, this is almost like social Darwinism, right? Where pure capitalism says, well, if you can't work, too bad. You better get someone else to help you. Otherwise, you're just lazy and a drag on the system. Like, what is this? Whereas communism would say, hey, from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs. So you need more, you can have more. That's fine, to be able to make everyone equal. Doesn't really work out that way in reality because absolute power corrupts absolutely, as Sierra said. Nice job. Fascism is a form of totalitarian dictatorship where the state controls. Totalitarian means the state controls everything. Fascism is obsessed with military power, with masculinity. It's obsessed with nationalism. It's hyper-nationalism. It's very, very far right, just as communism is very, very far left. Fascism is very, very far right. And then, so let me get to the bigger question here. Tigist, you're asking a great question. So big picture, why do you need to know these terms, or how do you need to know them? So capitalism, be aware that capitalism replaces mercantilism in period 3. Adam Smith writes The Wealth of Nations, aka The Birth of Capitalism book, in 1776. And so the United States is a capitalist country, albeit not 100%, right? Be aware that capitalism starts to unravel a little bit in period 6 after the Civil War with the Gilded Age, because people see all the cruel sides of this and how it looks really bad. And so they say, well, how about we're desperate, let's turn to something else. How about socialism or communism? The problem with socialism, the problem with communism is, unlike socialism, socialism says let's even out the inequalities by peaceful political ends. Run for office, pass laws. Communism, in its pure form, in its ideological form, says let's do this violently. Seize the means of production, seize the factories, take the stuff from the rich people and distribute it to the poor. A little more French Revolution-y. So during the Gilded Age, when you see communists and socialists, ideas spreading in the United States, particularly from immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe, people think those are very dangerous, especially when they start to associate them with anarchism, which is totally different, but that's even more violent. And so they start to go, oh no, socialism, communism, anarchism, all the same. They want to take my stuff and kill me. And then they get really nervous. Fascism, you need to know because of the Nazis in the 1930s. It's not AP World or AP Euro, so I wouldn't worry too much about that. But it's kind of important for modern American history, just because anytime any party starts to get kind of similar to the fascists or to the Nazis, it gets a little bit nerve-wracking, right? You're like, oh, you tend to be very obsessed with flags and marches and rallies and masculinity and nationalism and only one leader and obsessed with plots against that one leader, like think kind of Kim Jong-un-ish kind of stuff. So in that sense, it's like important for being good citizens. But for APUSH, I think you're okay. Whew, that was a long answer to that one. Oh, shoot. I think I just accidentally answered one that I didn't actually answer. Let's see if I can find this. We did that. A whole bunch of other questions. Oh, Ria was asking, like, no, we already answered that one too. I think we're good. Okay, I think we're good. Yeah, it feels, and then Sierra was saying, it feels like conservatives compare socialism to communism and liberals compare conservatism to fascism. You're indeed correct. And the reason for that is somewhat logical in the sense that, like, here's the American political spectrum, and as you go further this way, is this left for you folks? I think it is. The far left is communism, and far right is fascism. So those are the ideological extremes. Now, in reality, America in general is just a little bit far right compared to the rest of the world. So even your liberal Democrats are going to be just barely left of center, and your extreme liberals are still going to be relatively conservative by world standards. But take an AP Gov course, I suppose. But yep. Let's see. Alicia was asking, what are some tips on effectively sourcing documents? So a little bit hard to do without looking at a whole bunch of these, or a whole bunch of documents, but a couple of things for effectively sourcing documents. And if you want to know more, hitch a ride on one of those cram passes, because we talk about those at the end of every cram pass, and then we're going to have an entire one dedicated to just doing DBQs. So a little bit deeper dive there. But let's talk about that for right now. When it comes to HIPPing documents or analyzing documents, remember the HIPP, H-I-P-P, and then the O for outside evidence, or HAPPY maybe your teacher uses, but historical context, intended audience, purpose, and point of view of the author. My recommendation to you is a couple of things. One, always do historical context if you can, because historical context is a little bit easier in my mind to get. It's a little bit less fluffy, and you have to be able to show that you know what you're talking about. So do that and show what you know what you're talking about. If you're doing I, P, or P, you only have to do one of the four. But in reality, you kind of have to do I, P, P all together. Like, let's say we had a document that was one of FDR's New Deal programs, like a poster on the Social Security Act that I've seen before. You might want to talk about the context of the New Deal, maybe the 3 R's, the Great Depression, FDR's inauguration. You know tons of content about that. Go ahead and say that, and then use that in such a way to prove your thesis. If you're doing IPP, you shouldn't say the intended audience for this poster is the American people. Well, yeah, that's like painfully obvious, and it doesn't really add anything. Think about value added all the time, right? You constantly want to be saying, what am I giving them in exchange for them giving me credit or points for doing this particular skill? So if you're doing IPP, which I think you should do together, I think you should say, this poster was created to inform the American public about the new Social Security program that the FDR had created. FDR hoped that this would become popular enough that it would help people out and secure his chances of re-election. Ooh, well, now you've said why they're printing posters and to whom. And now you've actually started to say something, right? So that's really good. By the way, when it comes to hipping, one of the things that I like to suggest as well is each document suggests a bigger topic that you should be talking about in your DBQ. So if you see Social Security Act, you should talk about FDR's New Deal and the 3 Rs and all those things like that. And remember with PERLA, you only have to use 4 of them. I suggest you use all of them, using meaning summarizing and tying to your thesis in order to get the usage point. For hipping, you only have to do 2. So you've got plenty of mulligans for that. I would suggest doing 3 just to give yourself a little cushion, but that's okay. So think of each document as an example of a larger trend. So I would use the document, and then I would talk about how that document illustrates a larger trend, and that's how you do the IPP. So say FDR used his alphabet soup programs in order to make the Great Depression less stinky for the American public and to help them out during economic hard times. One example of this would be the Social Security Act, and then you talk about what the Social Security Act was. That's using the document. Now, in this hypothetical poster, you'd say, and they even created posters. So that's an example of the Social Security Act in action, and it shows how FDR was engaging with the American public, something like that. Anna was saying, this is your APUSH teacher's first year teaching APUSH. Oh, man, bless their heart. I remember that. That was scary, I tell you. Well, thanks for giving them a lot of grace. He did a lot of SAQs, which is great. That is the foundation and building block of all the writing. What would you recommend for those who barely covered DBQs? Couple of things. One, make sure that you're looking at, well, first of all, Fiveable has some excellent DBQ guides. There's also some other good ones on YouTube that you can find. Look up practice DBQs from past years. Look up sample essays. Even though this year's rubric is a little bit different, right? It's basically just expanded. So look up last year's DBQ. You can find that on the College Board website. Look up the past student responses. You can get them. They're already graded. So you can look at them and go, oh, look. And the scoring guide has a whole bunch of options for like, here's what a good thesis looks like. Here's what contextualization looks like. And then you can read whole student essays. So that's probably my first recommendation is read sample essays that have been scored before and get a sense of what they even look like. That'd be a great way to do it. Yeah, and Fiveable has some guides on the DBQ and stuff like that. There's a whole DBQ guide, etc. We also cover this a little bit in some of the free streams on Thursdays. We'll go over the rubric real quick. And then if you really want some deep dive into some writing stuff, that'd be a cram pass type thing. And Tegas is throwing down the Fiveable guides. Fantastic. Yeah. Heimler's History has some good tips. I'd recommend looking at that one. Khan Academy has some good ones. Good. Yeah. But and here's the thing on it too. If you've only done SAQs are again the building blocks of the entire DBQ. So if you're talking about contextualization, well, maybe you've talked about ACE before, that acronym for answering SAQs. Use ACE all the time. So when you talk about your contextualization, ACE it. And then have your thesis, and then in your body paragraphs, ACE your outside evidence. That's what you want to do to get the outside evidence point. So it's just basically using a whole bunch of SAQs, mini ones, in order to answer the DBQ together. Okay. Any other questions I can answer right now? Oh, sorry. ACE is answer, cite, explain, or expand. Basically, this just reminds you of what you need to do on a good SAQ. You want to make sure that you drop a vocab word, you define what it is, and you tell me why I should care and how it proves your thesis. So drop a vocab, define the vocab, explain why I should care and how it proves your thesis. Anytime you're using a vocab word in your essay, you should always define what it is and tell me why I should care. Every time. We don't give you points on the DBQ just for listing vocab like, oh, New Deal, FDR, AAA, CCC, PWA, good. And then move along, right? You have to use one of those. Tell me that you know what it means by defining it yourself and make it prove your thesis by saying this demonstrates how the FDR administration, yada, 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 right? So that'd be a good thing to do. We are almost out of time, so let's dive in a little bit to the economic review. I'll just go through these really quick. If you want to rewatch it later or look at the slides later, those will be posted on Fiveable. But just as a reminder, these question and answer sessions are mostly here for your questions, which were just all over the place. They were great questions, but they were from a whole bunch of different units. And then I kind of choose a specific topic to go over each week, just as a quick kind of thematic review. And I was thinking about doing some economic review this time. So, oh yeah, here's the DBQ stuff that we didn't even get to either. Nice job. So you've seen that before. Anna, for sure, look up the modified DBQ rubric on the College Board website after you're done looking through some of those videos and guides and things. So economic review, I would think of it like this. You want to look at economics? Well, think about labor, who's working, trade goods, what are they making, what are they trading, location, where is the trade occurring, where is economics occurring, industrialization, different kinds, where does it happen, how does it change things, technology, new inventions that make things more efficient, that transport things differently, that enable new industries to arrive, and then regulation. Is the economy getting regulated by the government? Are big business people trying to regulate themselves, et cetera? And then be aware of the boom and bust cycle, right? So depressions, recessions, panics, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a little bit period 2 and 1, or sorry. So let me make this a little bit bigger for you. Periods 2 and 1 are not necessarily on the exam, so I wouldn't worry about that too much, but you should know the Columbian Exchange, right? That's a big deal. Talks about transfer of people and goods, and it explains slavery, which is an important thing to be aware of. It explains population growth, etc. Excuse me. Be aware of each of the English colonies and what they make, right? New England is all about agriculture and commerce. So they do corn, beans, and fish, but also rockier soil. So they do things like rum, logging, shipbuilding, etc. The middle colonies are the breadbasket colonies, so cereal crops, wheat. Chesapeake colonies in North Carolina, they're going to be doing tobacco, richer soil. They have plantations. And then the southern ones and the Caribbean ones are going to be rice, indigo, sugar, labor-intensive cash crops. Cotton will come later. Yeah, so Ria, the managerial revolution could refer to a variety of things. One of them, I think, would be during period 6 when they start to introduce the idea of middle management. So it's no longer master and apprentice, or like one person that works and trains everyone else. It's more like we have the boss and we don't know who he is, the owner, we don't see him, but we have middle managers. And so we get corporations and corporate structures and things like that for the first time. First corporations, largely going to be railroads. Yeah. Remember, mercantilism is the thing in period 2 and then in period 3. So remember, with mercantilism, you want a positive balance of trade, as much specie as possible, and you want to import finished goods and then export raw materials. Or sorry, the other way around. Finished goods come from the mother colony or mother country, and then raw materials come from the colonies. And remember, for England, this is enforced via the Navigation Acts, but they're not enforced because of the expense, which means salutary neglect and smuggling and stuff like that, right? So be aware of that. Hamilton's financial plan is economic, right? That involves creating a national debt, a national bank, a whiskey tax, a tariff. Jefferson doesn't like this. Hamilton thinks this is necessary. His plan would have the government assume states' debts, etc., right? So be aware of that. Hamilton, remember, in the report on manufactures, wants to have a country that is fairly diverse in terms of its economic interests. Jefferson is being much more agrarian. And this is we're going to see this later with Whigs and Democrats too. Be aware of the market revolution, a whole bunch of new inventions, right? That happened, oh my goodness. And that's going to change how we communicate, how we transport things. The economy becomes much more widespread, interconnected, faster moving, etc. Period 5 continues that. And then period 5 and 6 are going to see things like the Gilded Age eventually, right? So power shifts, like we're going to use steam power, oil, kerosene instead of whale oil, new inventions, a whole bunch of those, Bessemer process. Women get involved in the workforce. There's robber barons. Period 6 is chock full of economic changes. You get Taylorism eventually, trusts and monopolies, strikes and labor unions, Knights of Labor, so be aware of those things. The Sherman Antitrust Act tries to regulate it. And is it really laissez-faire? But as I said before, it's really about taking the side of the big businessmen. Transcontinental Railroad would be a great example of a new invention or innovation, for sure. Brings the country together. Be aware of the New South, right? Henry Grady's idea for industrialization down south, not just cotton anymore. There's still cotton and it's still a big deal, and there's still segregation, But we're going to introduce some new industrialization, even in the midst of things like convict leasing, etc. Free trade. Oh, okay, so free market is the same thing as capitalism. So just do whatever you want. And then free trade is going to involve no tariffs. Henry Grady is just a guy from the South who talked about the New South, kind of invented the idea, gave a famous speech about it. So just if you see Henry Grady, be aware that he's probably talking about the New South and industrializing the South after the Civil War, because they didn't have any industry, and that made them kind of stuck at the Civil War, which I suppose was a good thing. But then this includes increased economic opportunities during the Gilded Age, right, for an increase in the middle class, managerial workers, the managerial revolution, as Ria was mentioning, the Tuskegee Institute with this guy, Booker T. Washington. Consumer culture becomes a thing during the Gilded Age. So camping and libraries and the circus become a thing. So people have money to spend on that kind of stuff. Oh, man. Standard of living actually goes up and prices go down thanks to the manufacturing and more efficiency, right? But there are some reform movements in response to this. Ida B. Wells, etc. Think the progressives, muckrakers, social gospel people, the WCTU, NASA, just being like, hey, the economy is unregulated and this is causing problems, especially as people drink, et cetera, et cetera. So be aware of some of that. We'll get to that more in our period 6 review. And then Jane Addams, Hull House, et cetera, political machines become a thing. That's more political. And then be aware of things like the Populist Party, the Populist Party, remember, is all about silver. And there's the whole arguments over tariffs and gold or silver, things like that. And then the Unit 7 economy, just to kind of give you a quick list here, Unit 7 is way too big. But if you think about the economy in period 7, you should think about the progressives and regulation, as we already mentioned, the laissez-faire 1920s, where there were a lot more consumer goods, right? We're talking like washing machines and radios and stuff like that. The roaring 20s and technology is going to change that. Fordism, moving assembly line, et cetera. And then Unit 7 economy really focuses on the 1930s with the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl. It hits manufacturing, hits farmers. Then FDR and his New Deal try to solve that, and that's going to make a bunch of economic changes. We've talked about the New Deal a lot already today. And then World War II changes with the arsenal of democracy, and that's going to be when the United States gears up again to help England and help fight World War II, gets us out of a depression, and there you go. We have all of periods 3 through 7 economic, just kind of briefly. Notice there was a lot in period 4, 6, and 7. I'd be aware of those, particularly Unit 6, right? That incorporates the Gilded Age, and that's a big deal. All right, any final questions? We got to wrap things up here. How would you differentiate the middle class from the others? Well, they're not super rich. They don't maybe have their own mansions or things like that. They don't own companies, but they might be managers, or they might be in middle positions that are a bit more skilled. And the middle class might have some disposable income, so they're not like teetering on the brink of poverty. And then the lower class or working class would be doing undesirable jobs, your miners, your sharecroppers, etc. Industrial workers too sometimes if it's unsafe conditions. So a variety of options there. Okay. Well, that's all that I had. I hope you folks have enjoyed this. Hopefully this question and answer session has been somewhat useful to you. You folks brought a lot of good questions. Thank you very much. Glad you're here and glad we can be together. Hey, so remember, we have a review over units 5 and 6, kind of a broad content overview tomorrow night at 9. And then there's also the student-led ones. Check out the Fiveable community, whole bunch of those. There's a whole bunch of student-led review parties and things like that. Fiveable Olympics is coming up. That's fantastic. So a lot of opportunities for you. And then if you want some more deep dive, especially into the writing practice, check out the cram passes and the cram sessions that happen on Tuesdays. And then next week, don't forget, we have one on Thursday as well. Let's see. Schaefer was asking, how can you apply American System by Henry Clay throughout some periods? Henry Clay's American System is basically just in period 4, but it involves internal improvements and infrastructure, which I suppose that happens in other periods too, but mostly think period 4 before the Civil War. Okay, you folks have been fantastic. I hope that you are doing all right and staying safe and sane during this odd time. And yeah, we'll see you next time. Thank you very much for joining us.